Putin alone against 5 American presidents: Bill Clinton, George Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, Joe Biden. A single Putin. And a war is pushing the relationship between Russia and the US to the brink of irreparability. However, it would be unfair to say that everything has come to this point solely because of Putin or the current US president, who is simultaneously providing massive aid to Ukraine and declaring that allowing Kyiv to penetrate deep into Russian territory is not out of the question, because that event was seeded and nurtured over many years. In reality, how did the struggle where Putin has soloed against 5 generations of US presidents play out to lead to today's situation? In 1987, at the height of the Cold War,
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Vladimir Putin was just a young KGB officer stationed in Germany, trained to counter America. With Lieutenant Colonel Putin at the front lines, the fall of the Soviet Union, with the hand of the US president in it, must have been a turning point. Russians, including Putin, couldn't help but feel humiliated under the hand of the sole remaining superpower when Reagan's successor declared the end of the Soviet era as a victory.
Eastern Europe is free. The Soviet Union itself is no more. This is a victory for democracy and freedom. It's a victory for the moral force of our values.
Democracy, freedom, morality. But Putin has never been interested in the values that America wants to impose on the rest of the world. Therefore, upon touching the presidential chair, Putin was determined to restore Russia's power and status. As Trump would put it, make Russia great again. Putin's new era began coincidentally with the final months of Bill Clinton's presidency in 2000. The two leaders met in Moscow, primarily to discuss the national missile defense system the US wanted to build. However, during the joint press conference, neither seemed to look at or smile at each other. Later, Clinton recounted that he found Putin personally cold but capable.
If you want to know what my personal assessment is, I think he is fully capable of building a prosperous, strong Russia while preserving freedom and pluralism and the rule of law.
If Clinton hoped to win American-style democracy here, he seemed to be disappointed. Just a year earlier, an event had caused tension between the two countries to stretch thin. On March 24, 1999, NATO bombarded Yugoslavia for 10 hours straight. This was the first military action against a sovereign nation by the 50-year-old military alliance. NATO, led by the US, did not hide its intention to target Yugoslavia. NATO always sought to intervene in Yugoslavia's internal affairs under the pretext of resolving long-standing ethnic and religious conflicts in the country. By brazenly attacking the territory of a sovereign state like Yugoslavia, the US and NATO sent a message that they had the right to impose their views not through political initiatives, but through military force, even without the UN Security Council's permission. Later that year, Putin, as prime minister, launched his second action in Chechnya. This was Clinton's response.
Russia will pay a heavy price for those actions, with each passing day sinking more deeply into a morass that will intensify extremism and diminish its own standing in the world.
However, in reality, those who committed unforgivable actions both inside and outside Chechnya destabilized security and disrupted the lives of the people. In fact, there was no quagmire conclusion. In May 2000, Putin realized his goal of directly taking over Chechnya. It was a heavy blow to the US and Europe's intention to destabilize Chechnya, to sever Russia's lifeline connection to the Middle East through Chechnya's gateway. Since then, Western public opinion has labeled Putin as cold-blooded and decisive. However, at the same time, Putin's public support rate skyrocketed. In just 3 short months after he took office as prime minister in August 1999, this rate was 31%, and by November, it had risen to 80%. Soon after, Clinton's successor, George Bush, took office with the goal of stabilizing relations with Russia.
I look forward to working with Mr. Putin and explaining my point of view and my attitude about the post-Cold War era. I'm going to look him right in the eye and say, you're no longer the enemy.
Bush's first meeting with the Russian leader was very warm.
Question. I looked the man in the eye. I found it to be very straightforward. I was able to get a sense of his soul. He's a man deeply committed to his country and the best interests of his country.
However, the relationship later deteriorated due to disagreements over the Iraq War, the U.S. missile defense plan in Eastern Europe, and Russian internal policies that Bush saw as increasingly authoritarian. When the Russia-Georgia War broke out in the final days of Bush's second term in 2008, he confronted Putin directly at the Beijing Olympics, warning the Georgian president as a hothead. In his memoirs, Bush noted that Putin replied, "I'm also hot-blooded." Bush then responded, "No, Vladimir, you are cold-blooded."
We're a peaceful nation.
Also, the peacemaker speaks.
American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
Bush ordered the flattening of Iraq for a vial of salt or detergent. Peaceful, huh? As Iraq became a quagmire for the U.S., Putin declared he would not let the U.S. president preach about Russian democracy. He didn't want a democracy like Iraq's.
Перешагнула свои национальные границы и, по сути, во всех сферах, и в экономике, и в политике, и в гуманитарной сфере навязывается другим государствам. Ну, кому это понравится? Кому это понравится?
Surely not an Iraqi, since the U.S. jumped in. Iraq used to be like this. Has become a chaotic paradise. Bush faced heavy criticism. Meanwhile, what about the Georgia story Bush had lectured Putin on? Georgia, a former Soviet state that had turned to the West, wanted to join NATO. On the other hand, the Georgian government pursued a policy of suppressing pro-Russian activists within the country, especially after NATO pledged it would eventually accept Georgia into NATO. The Georgian leadership, emboldened, launched an attack on the pro-Russian separatist region of South Ossetia on the eve of the 2008 Beijing Olympics. However, just 5 days later, Russian forces completely repelled Georgian troops. This was undoubtedly one of the shortest wars in history. On August 15, 2008, the Georgian president, who wanted to turn his country into an anti-Russian outpost in Europe, even signed a ceasefire agreement with Russia. It seems Bush was wrong. The Georgian president wasn't as hot-headed as Putin. Putin didn't hesitate to mention the U.S. presidential election system. He pointed out, the U.S. president is not directly elected by American voters, while in Russia, the president is directly elected by the people. The implication behind this remark is that, at least in presidential elections, Russia is more democratic than the U.S. This comment obviously struck a nerve with Bush. Everyone knows that in the 2000 presidential election, Bush received fewer popular votes than his opponent Al Gore, but won due to the Electoral College votes. And now we come to Barack Obama, who also took office with plans to rebuild relations with Russia. However, almost from day one, as U.S. now president, Barack Obama found himself increasingly at odds with President Putin. Obama's working relationship with Putin was mostly marked by sanctions and diplomatic deadlock. The great game between Obama and Putin was here, Syria. Washington backed the political upheavals known as the Arab Spring to gain control of the geopolitically crucial Middle East region and push Russia out of the area. For President Obama, the Arab Spring was as significant for the U.S. as the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, marking the beginning of the collapse of the socialist system. Therefore, after the U.S. and NATO ousted President Gaddafi in October 2011, Senator John McCain declared that the Libya scenario would be repeated in Syria, Iraq, post-Soviet space, and Russia. The Obama administration was completely wrong in believing that the Arab Spring could topple Middle Eastern regimes and establish democracies. After returning to the Kremlin in 2012, President Putin decided to help Syria, Russia's ally in the Middle East, to avert the Arab Spring threat. Thus, in reality, the war in Syria became a showdown between two poles. And then an apparently unrelated event occurred in 2014 when Putin annexed Crimea as the post-Maidan revolution government in Ukraine had completely distanced itself from Russia, seeking to join NATO at all costs. You must know that without Ukraine, Russia can never become a sovereign, independent superpower in a multipolar world order. Only if the US-led West can separate Ukraine from Russia will the US-led unipolar world order not collapse. The annexation of Crimea initially disrupted the US's strategic plan in Ukraine. Subsequently, Russia, along with France and Germany, co-sponsored Kyiv's government and the self-proclaimed Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics to sign the Minsk Agreement to peacefully resolve the Ukraine crisis. Thanks to this, Putin froze the crisis to focus on resolving the threat in Syria, which resulted in a brilliant success. It's understandable why President Obama once described Putin as a tough character, saying that Putin reminded him of the political bosses he encountered early in his career in Chicago. For his part, Putin never hid his dislike for Obama. He said that Obama was never elected by the American people to be favorable to Russia. As for me, I still don't quite understand why Obama received the Nobel Peace Prize. Because if any president during his term kept the US out of any military actions abroad, it was President Donald Trump. From the start of his term, the most unique president in history, Trump was marked by accusations of Russian interference in the 2016 US presidential election.
Every US intelligence agency has concluded that Russia did.
I have President Putin. He just said it's not Russia. I will say this, I don't see any reason why it would be.
The special friendship between the two leaders was marked by public admiration.
The problem is not that Putin is smart, which of course he's smart, but the real problem is that our leaders are dumb.
Trump's friendliness towards Putin sometimes led to accusations of weakening American interests or being soft on the Kremlin chief. However, it's clear that Trump can be tough when he wants to. During Trump's presidency, the US implemented many trade and military security policies to counter China's rise. For his part, Putin seemed to appreciate Trump's willingness to bypass conventional diplomatic norms. However, Putin remained cautious, aware of the political instability that Trump's presidency brought. And then the 46th US president is named Joe Biden, who coincidentally was Obama's vice president.
I don't trust the Soviets.
Clearly inheriting from the former President Obama administration. Since Biden took office, US-Russia relations have returned to a more confrontational direction, with Biden openly criticizing Putin and taking a tough stance on issues like human rights and Ukraine's sovereignty.
Oh, I think he is a war criminal.
Кто как обзывается, тот так и называется. Мы всегда в другом человеке видим свои собственные качества и думаем, что он такой же, как и мы. И из этого исходя.
Ваш адрес сумасшедший сукин сын.
Но я полагаю, что для нас, для России, Байден более предпочтительный президент. И судя по тому, что он сейчас сказал, я абсолютно прав.
The US and Russia have never been this distant. And now let's go back to the beginning. I became president in 2000. I thought, okay, it's over. The Yugoslav issue is done. We need to try to restore relations. After all, open the door Russia is trying to pass through. And furthermore, I talked about this publicly. I can recall mentioning this during a meeting at the Kremlin with outgoing Bill Clinton right next door in the hall over there. I said to him, posing a question, "Listen, Bill, if Russia raises the issue of joining NATO, what do you think? Is it feasible?" Suddenly he said, "This is interesting. I think it is." Then in the afternoon when we met for dinner, he said, "I talked to my people, to my team. Turns out, no, now it's impossible." It turns out Putin had once proposed Russia joining NATO to Bill Clinton himself. Looking back, it's amazing to think what would have happened if the two leaders had more trust in each other. Would Ukraine not have fallen into its current plight? Would US-Russia relations have avoided returning to Cold War-like conditions? Or is it inevitable for Russia and the US to become rivals? Because the world order should not be unipolar as it has been since World War II. And with the possibility of Donald Trump returning to the White House in the upcoming November election, Could everything change?